Olá, boa tarde. Perguntando aqui à técnica se podemos começar. Sim, obrigada. Não conseguimos ver a Kathryn. Já está. Obrigada. Tudo ótimo para começar. Boa tarde. Hi, Kathryn. Boa tarde às pessoas que estão aqui presentes. Obrigada por terem vindo. Boa tarde às pessoas que estão remotamente também. Obrigada por acompanharem. Hoje será uma sessão muito diferente. Será uma sessão híbrida, o que traz outras camadas, que também pode ser interessante. Este desdobramento entre a presença e a ausência que se faz presente noutros lugares, que também vai fazer parte da relação do visível e do invisível que acontece nesta conversa. Aqui comigo está a Ana Naomi de Sousa. Obrigada, Ana, por aceitares o convite e por estares aqui. Em Londres está a Kathryn Yusoff. Thank you, Kathryn, once again. Esta sessão terá também tradução simultânea, para que todas as pessoas possam acompanhar, para que todas as pessoas possam entender, para que seja uma conversa coletiva, de certa forma. Rapidamente dizer que a Kathryn Yusoff é professora de Geografia Inumana, que é um conceito muito interessante, na Mary Elizabeth University, em Londres, e a Ana Naomi de Sousa é jornalista e é realizadora. Esta conversa hoje, que tem como título Earth as a Medium of Struggle, acontece dentro do ciclo Semear. Eu sou a Melissa Rodrigues, não disse há bocadinho, sou programadora de discurso, e este ciclo Semear é o terceiro ciclo iniciado nestes movimentos, digamos assim, desde que eu estou a programar aqui no TBA, desde setembro do ano passado. Começámos em setembro com o tema do fogo, iniciámos então começámos a queimar o fogo com o seu poder de transformação cósmica. Depois do fogo, em janeiro, passámos para o fertilizar e o nutrir, pensar em como é que podemos fertilizar, nutrir, criar outras possibilidades de mundo, criar e inventar outras formas de relação e de coletividade. Pensar na ideia da queima como uma ideia de trazer algo de diferente, trazer mudança, e que essa mudança seja radical. Também esta ideia de o que fazer depois do fogo, não é? Como cuidar depois do fogo. Então, depois do fertilizar e nutrir, entramos no semear, e agora pensamos em semear futuros, semear passados, reparar também esses passados, porque semeá-los é repará-los, e pensamos também em reflexões, várias reflexões sobre revoluções, sobre utopias, e sobre o impossível, porque o impossível é muito importante. É importante pensar nesta ideia do impossível como uma forma de caminhar e como uma forma de futuro. Fico por aqui, nesta intervenção. Vou deixar aqui a Ana Naomi de Sousa. Obrigada mais uma vez à conversa com a Kathryn. Até já. Boa sessão.
Obrigada, Melissa. I'm going to speak in English. We have the translation for Portuguese. Thank you to Melissa, and thank you to TBA. We have, this nice technical setup here. Kathryn, we're sorry that you can't be here with us in Lisbon, but it's great to have this opportunity to talk to you about your work at this sort of time in the world where there are so many directions in which we could take this conversation later. I know that there are some people here and online who are really keen to have this opportunity to talk to you, who've been following your work for a long time. I think for now, I'll pass over to you for your presentation, which I'm really excited to see. And then we can have a conversation afterwards, and we'll be taking questions from the audience in the room and online. So, do keep your questions towards the end. Thanks very much, Kathryn. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Anna and Melissa and Rita, really for facilitating this conversation. And very sorry I can't be there in Lisbon. as I very much wanted to. Unfortunately, I couldn't travel. But so apologies in advance if nothing is clear, because I'm not entirely 100%. But hopefully this should mean that I'll slow down, which may be advantageous with the translation. So I wanted to really start this story in Lisbon and go back to the Lisbon earthquake and the geotrauma of the Lisbon earthquake in order to unpack some of the ideas about the history of geology and where we might think about a kind of new earth from that vantage point. So it began very much earlier in breaking worlds that colonial geology made. So Lisbon was only Lisbon because of those geographies and extractive geologies that constituted it from elsewhere. So what was at stake in colonial Earth was Earth states, changes of states, planetary, subjective, geographic, changes of state that gave rise to new Earths and new atmospheres of thinking and action rather than simply geopolitical shifts. So these changes of state also broke worlds and unhomed people and ecological reciprocities. This story of colonial Earth relates to nothing less than a fundamental shift in the discourse and practice of materiality, or what I think of as an inhumane knowledge practices that became a planetary state. So there's two stories that I really want to concentrate on today to sketch out briefly. And the first is the colonial Earth practices that shaped the Earth and how geophysics was underpinned by geographical imaginaries of the world and their social relations, namely race. And the second Earth practice, or Earth as a medium of insurgent struggle, is a story about the earthbound practices that were made in the shadow geologies of colonialism. So I take colonialism as the origin story, not to orient around it because it's the beginning of the world, but it is the beginning of the current planetary geologic state. In cultural discourse, at least, the Anthropocene has not yet been ratified by the scientific committee. But we can say colonial Earth is Anthropocene Earth, not because anything should be organized through the colonial construction of the event, but because the question that lingers about climate and Earth futures has its past in these material and theoretical practices, and pasts that are crucial to the vigilance we need in the present about how pasts become futures and the position of the excluded is reproduced. So there are missing Earths that lie in the wake of colonialism. Ending worlds and breaking Earth was a precondition for colonialism and the worlds that were built from colonial extraction of value. Geologic practices of white geology were practices of unhoming. As hooves and crops transformed, they also erased ecologies that belonged to other Earths and ancestral geomorphologies. So Lisbon was a shock in colonial grounds. The geopsychic shock of the Lisbon earthquake on November the 1st, 1755, launched the fields of earth sciences and natural philosophy in the West and the geologic traditions we've inherited that now form and constitute the practices of resource and natural resources and colonial minerality. At the time of the earthquake, Lisbon was the fourth largest city in Europe, the third busiest port, and one of the wealthiest cities in the world from the traffic in enslaved persons and from the extraction of metals and diamonds from South America. So 850 tons of gold were sent to Lisbon from Brazil in the 18th century alone, and an estimated 2,000 enslaved persons arrived from Africa per year from 1490 onwards. 2,000. European modernity was materialized through black and gold. The so-called colonial revenue of Brazil and the enslavement of first Moors, then Chinese, Malay, and Indian subjects was followed by the industrial enslavement of Africans. This colonial revenue of Black and brown subjects built the public infrastructure and the elaborate monuments and proto-scientific institutes of Lisbon in which the Enlightenment took shape. Portugal had established naval outposts and commercial networks that connected Lisbon to Nagasaki along the coasts of Africa, the Middle East, India, and South Asia. This is the geography of what Lisa Lowe calls the intimacy of the four continents, where she says, the coloniality of the modern world is not brute binary division, but rather one that operates through precisely spatialized and temporalized processes of both differentiation and connection. The earthquake, tsunami, and subsequent fire disrupted Portugal's trade in enslaved persons, and it dampened its imperial geography and colonial ambitions. The earthquake disrupted the primacy of civic and maritime functioning of Lisbon, and consequently Britain increased its trade in human persons. Portugal and Britain were the two largest enslaving nations, accounting for about 70% of all enslaved Africans transported to the Americas. So the earthquake itself was considered the first modern disaster, since it generated a coordinated statewide and Europe-wide response to attend to the disaster and set in place planning to mitigate future disasters. The disaster became mapped into the governance of infrastructures and imaginations of urban planning as a sociality of risk and preparedness. At a broader philosophical level, the earthquake highlighted how the psychic foundations of fear of an inhuman planet were implicated in the combined mastery of matter, the codification of race, and the birth of the modern subject. Within the context of the wealth generated from enslavement and mineral trade in gold and diamonds, Lisbon represented a moment of emergence of European cosmopolitanism, both in the development of the Enlightenment arrangements of nature, science, and the earth, and through the geographical emergence of Europe as a distinct entity that was built on subterranean geotraumas of colonialism. So there's three themes that I want to draw attention to here, and that's the role of geotrauma in world making and earth breaking. And secondly, earth revolutions and race as the basis of modernity and modern thought. Thirdly, the earth as a medium of struggle in the context of colonialism and its afterlives. And fourth, to kind of move towards a new geoethics and how we might think about an anti-racist earth praxis. So the role of geotrauma. The earthquake itself was claimed as a European geophysical event, despite its effect on North Africa. Disaster relief came from other European cities. There were refugee camps, and European media covered the event. And maybe if we can bear in mind the refugee camps of today as we think about those of Lisbon. The European media covered the event. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant, sitting in Kreuzberg, wrote his treatise on natural science from newspaper clippings. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe theorized from Weimar. The disaster is often seen as a turning point in the conceptualization of Western human history, where the attributes of natural history shifted from supernatural causation, from God to natural causation, earth. So the earthquake enacted a shocking material and conceptual destabilization, initiating geo and social revolutions of equal measure. There was not yet a science of the earth at this time in the West, but the event was taken up by many Enlightenment thinkers, Rousseau, Voltaire, Kant, to challenge the interpretation of the origination of the earth and its forces. And in doing so, their thought replaced divine intervention with a concept of reason. As an ontological telos that resolved the material dilemma of life on an inhuman planet, And in the natural sciences, the fields of seismology and scientific geology became established. So Enlightenment reason produced the idea of nature as a separate autonomous entity with a capital N, inhuman, distinct from religious authority and its transcendental telos. Kant, who was one of the first to teach geography and was obsessed by the Lisbon earthquake. Walter Benjamin called Kant the first geographer because of his theories of seismic and earth origination, published A Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens in 1755 to address the event and the question of cataclysmic geologic events in metaphysical life. His legacy, the critique of pure reason, secured a position for the observer from afar as an adjudicator on knowledge and the earth, whereby the faculty of geophysical understanding provided a means with which to gain resolve over inhuman terror. So this problem of the seismic shattering of the telos of meaning, however, demonstrated a thornier problem for philosophers. The Lisbon earthquake demonstrated how geotrauma produced an equation between earth events and new modes of thought and models of subjectivity, demonstrating what the earth does to thought, how it arranges disciplines, modes of inquiries, and institutions. But it also evidenced the anthropomorphism, the self-insulating drives of Enlightenment subjectivity in the context of a dynamic earth, and especially of white subjectivity, where race came to stand in between that fear of an inhuman planet and the possibility of Enlightenment subjectivity. So Lisbon highlighted the importance of the geomateriality of thought in colonial mastery. It launched into being an idea of what I call geologic life, a particular historically situated understanding of how geology has materially shaped both the planet and subjectivity. Geologic life is also a critical mode for interrogating how theories of the inhuman and historical geographies of geology changed the language of the earth, geographical imaginaries, and accounts of life. I seek to examine how geology historically produced an account of racial difference in the traffic between inhuman as matter and inhuman as race, and continues to do so in the ongoing racial stratifications of environmental exposures and extractions, and in the weaponization of geology as a site of enactment of spatial relations of race, such as how the sea or the desert or herbicide is mobilized as a racial border guard. So alongside the cataclysmic event, a shift occurred in the 1760s through to the 1820s from geology as a practice of determining localized forms of strata for the commercial purposes of extraction to geology as a temporal practice of determining the status of beings in time and theories of the earth. The notion of tectonics or a moving earth began to emerge as an answer to the question of faults and tremors at Lisbon. This heralded the beginning of the idea of natural laws that populated an understanding of the universal as a monotemporality of material states. James Hutton, considered the originator of modern geology and a cornerstone of rational scientific thought, published his Theory of the Earth in 1788. This shift in geophilosophy also marked the naming of paleontology as a key branch in the discipline of geology, understood as the study of ancient beings through the bodies of contemporary organisms. Fossil life was studied in relation to contemporary anatomical life in a comparative mode. Fossils were used to narrativize the story of the earth as told through a corporeal lens, whereby life forms animated the strata. Paleontology sat alongside stratigraphy, ordering of the materiality of time through sequential strata and comparative anatomy, the ordering of racialized bodies of species through their difference, applied in the sphere of human species and their racialization. So geology was a differentiating machine and a naming machine in its first instance, producing codes of temporal and racial difference through the ordering of bodies and through times of the earth. The power of the idea of racial difference that paleontologists perpetuated in the history of geologic thought was mobilized in the traction between material and metaphor. The grammars of geology enacted the material extraction and theft of land and peoples, and the metaphor of supremacy over those lands and peoples stretched the empirical into imaginaries that validated the material gains of whiteness. While the material and symbolic are often separated as distinct regimes, as force, matter, and metaphysics or representation, grammars of geology relay between the two as an identifying and idealizing materiality in regimes of power. So this simultaneous articulation of the earth and being by paleontologists mobilized geophysical relays that accrued authority in space and across time. Geology became a first ordering principle in the arrangements of Western matter, materialism, and thought, as well as a racializing axis in the production of the human as a being in time and space, and the human's twin, the inhuman. The ontological material ground of the human's origination was the position and ideation of the inhuman, as the materiality of actual European bodies was secured through the inhumanities of colonial violence and enslavement. The institution building and conceptual scaffolding that structured this relation between being and time organized the very possibilities and scope of thought and its governance through its partition, so that being as bios and time as geos. The meta-epistemic ordering of this geologic nomenclature, so bios and geos, through stratigraphy, formation, strata, and the empirics of temporal designation, created the normative modes for understanding ontology as social and subjective. Geology then has an extra epistemological dimension precisely because it's the story of the earth and of life, and because temporal lines of making beings in time secures emplacement in the world and forms of origination, so origin stories and against the fear of an inhuman planet. Joining the earth, a non-teleological entity, to the telos of the subject in the organization of natural history, lithically made the white subject at home in the world through a material telos. Geology was a locational device for being and time that had a primal grounding because its symbolic and actual ground was the earth, and whereby mastery of the earth materially brought subjective elevation. So we can think of colonial geology as a distinct form of earth writing. Through conquistador and settler narratives of origins of discovery, and the role of purposeful extraction as a moral narrative of development that hid the theft of land and peoples. We can also see geology as a form of earth writing with hooves, plantations, pests, disease, cattle and sheep, and the transformation of land into mines. Geology was a medium for coming into modernity and political time. Geology is a site of racial, social, and spatial struggle for subjectivity, geographical attachment, and ecology. So confidence in the fossil record grows incrementally through New World invasion and the intensification of colonial practices of economic extraction. So it's not incidental that extraction of new geologic materials was intimately tied to the encounter with other forms of past alien life and the codification of races in time. Rather than treat this historical location and geographical project of geology's origins as a background to the narrative of patriarchal lineage or the fathers of geology story, I want to place this colonial material praxis at its center. And I do so to articulate how the genealogy of inhuman materialism and the narrative of patriarchal figures both erases the transgressive nature of the discipline across multiple fields of cosmology, subjectivity, race, sexuality, and power, and how these dynamics shape the structural violence of its gender practices, both historically and contemporaneously. This fathering of geology established a patriarchal relation to matter through both the identification of beings in time, a temporal identity politics, so thinking about here about race as placing people in time, as this kind of temporal identity politics, and established paternalism and a hierarchy of interpretation over the earth. So historically, the formation of geology is intimate to colonialism, racial capitalism, and slavery, entwined with the philosophies of racial biocentricism in the material practices of colonial survey and extraction and the imposition of settler territory. While geology is often seen as playing a supporting role to biological theories of life, or we might here say biopolitics, backgrounded to the mineralogical field in which organic life takes place and makes space in the vastness of time, it emerged as the ground of both philosophies of life and natural philosophies of the earth and nature, as well as the origination of Enlightenment ethical and political subjectivity. The human constituted as it was through the inhuman, as the idea of freedom was crafted through slavery. So as a philosophical discipline, geology was a history of ideas about the origination of the earth and earth beings, which was materially made through the practice of colonialism and its racial praxis. So it is the verticality of stratigraphy as the positioning of fossils as hierarchical organized beings in time that is mapped into the meta-hominid differences that create the spatial coordinates of white supremacy as a geophysical condition or levitation. This geophysical imagination is important for the ways in which race is deployed as a regulator of stratal relations, which are simultaneously imagined and produced as race. Through this mode of stratal governance, transcendental whiteness as the Enlightenment subject is produced through the earth, but not of the earth. In the panic of losing one's God at Lisbon, another mode of governance of the subject called reason was created, but the desire for an overseer remained, and so the telos of materiality was created. This is why Western philosophy can seemingly float above its geographies, touching down occasionally, but without concern for the grit of the ground and impervious to its inorganic reason. This is the will to universalism as a release from the earth and its gravity of material or inhuman demands. If the Lisbon earthquake was the first geotrauma to shake Western thought, the second was the incremental discovery of deep time and what it conferred about the nature of existence and the extinction of everything without exception. The idea that everything was but a moment in time, in the depths of time, gone in the blink of a geologic eye, was enough to send European fragility into some murderous compensatory activity in pursuit of inhuman materiality. This was the psychic rub in which Western theory builds its armor of protection. Inhuman nature triggers the deep recesses of white fragility as inhumane rage. While various theories have proceeded with the dismantling of the nature-culture binary, they have often left the geos-bios binary intact because of the cost for that desegregation involves in terms of dismantling whiteness. Blackness became a stand-in for the abysmal confrontation, like totemic gods of distraction placed in the interregnum of the inhuman to protect the autonomy of the human. It was the historic location of blackness in relation to gold as elevation that organized the politics of this inhumane exchange. Stratal overburden was the material resolution for Western thought of the libidinal terror and vulnerability of living on a dynamic planet. So as race was materialized in the 17th and 19th century through an attention to and narrativization of contemporary physiology, geologic zoning, and the geographic originations of race, it produced not just the spatialization of temporality or the time of race and the time race takes, but more importantly, it presupposed a staggered arrival and extinction of races in the present, which in turn naturalized ideas of race war and ascendancy through a sedimented progressive race narrative. Thus, the racialized arguments that are made through white supremacy are not just about biology and the performance of phenotypical subjects, but are mobilized through geologic temporality and geographical imaginations about the philosophy of material economies. The spatialization of race through time is used to legitimize a right for whiteness to the political present, whereby power is realized via a spatial project of time. The eugenics of biological thought and environmental determinism, which posits hierarchical understandings of different geographical racial zones, has been critically attended to as a pseudoscience, although its resurgence as white supremacy is in the resurgence. But the role of geology in embedding and legitimizing racial violence as a rival, or telos, has a quieter register in the histories of science and humanities. Think here of the narrative of development, for example. By spacing the human in geologic time as a differentiation, meaning over the vastness of time was secured to cushion the monstrous indifference of the earth to the maintenance of creaturely life. Geology as a heuristic or a way of learning is a means by which to understand the effective aesthetic, political, and economic modes of existence in relation to the earth as a first-order realism or the ground of Enlightenment thought. So there was a reason that Kant was obsessed by the Lisbon earthquake, and Goethe was the overseer of mines and an avid rock collector and theorist of the earth, as was von Humboldt. Geologic realism as the ground of every figuration is so sedimented into Western thought that it's often backgrounded as the surface to events, at the same time as it's mobilized as a kind of violent policeman within kind of the hardening of geopolitical borders. So the idea of the earth as resource and political formation of territory and naturalized relations to the ground that sediment particular political and racial accounts of space and their normative social sexual arrangements. It's not just that there's an overlooked lithic ground beyond extraction economies, but that geologic sciences produce geophilosophies and theories of being that were forged through the earth as the empirical object, and thus they had a primary claim to naturalizing those relations. So alongside this story of beings in time, the human earth story is the making of non-beings in time, the inhuman story, a form of non-existence that is established by the historical classification of the inhuman as an interment both in the materiality of race and in a parallel psychic register of capture. Thus, the inhuman is established and perforated as a concept by its origination in the slave mineral complex of black gold, coal black, black sugar, whereby blackness was made equivalent to a material from the earth's crust created in a cataclysmic event. Blackness was positioned both outside and within geography as a libidinal buffer to the inhuman and as a lithic buffer of geophysical force in the extraction of value. Because of the subjective ties of the inhuman at the inception of its languaging, the inhuman can never be encountered as the thing in itself or via a kind of just materiality. That is not to say that there's no materialist autonomy outside of and beyond, before and internal to this racial subjectification, but the language of apprehension of the material world that code normative modes of materiality are not neutral. Geologic grammars historically established a colonial politics of recognition of materiality, enacted through the extractive praxis of personhood, of land, mineral, and metal. This categorization of matter enacted a form of spatial execution and substitution of subjective relation through the geographical displacement, relocation, and transformation. So if we begin with the idea that displacement is a geotrauma, then acts of desecration entail acts of description. In human memory might well be a resource and a site of repair for recovering other forms of environmental futures. In human memory is a praxis for geographical engagement. So we have a familiarity now with the burning of Earth archives in planetary combustion and the decomposition of ecological arrangements in the disappearance of shared ecologies. But thinking alongside the inhuman tactics of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people to deploy environmental knowledge as a mode of generating spatial and political freedom, we can take seriously the counter-archives of the Earth. If a rock can be a collector of stories of disobedience, a witness to rebellion, and the countenance that claims time outside the colonial clock and its abrupt changed Earth, can the inhuman then have a different future? If Earth archives are understood as a site of redress, building spaces of remembrance, ghosts and shifting temporalities in the colonial afterlives of extractive Earth, then new museums of Earth might need to be built and imagined. There are pedagogical implications here, discourses and representations of matter and materialism matter, interrogating the social, geophysical, and political assumptions built into the concept of the Anthropocene, for example. We need to change the way we read geology as a site of geotrauma and a site, for want of a better word, of geoethics. We might understand this question of geoethics as using the past to pose new future-orientated questions, questions that are posed towards a different iteration or idea of the Earth. As Frantz Fanon reminds us, we ought to use the past with the intention of opening up the future. It is an invitation to an action and a basis of hope. Breaking with colonial categories highlights the importance of languages of the inhuman that are not organized around this bios and geos divide. Indigenous, Black, Brown, queer, and non-normative literatures, where we understand aesthetics as a way of scripting and inscripting the Earth differently and creating imaginative lures in the geography of sense. The importance of geographical imaginations for world building and geofuturity suggests that spatial reparations are needed in an ethics for anti-racist Earth. If every text, image, act, and description is understood to be involved in building worlds speculatively and imaginatively, what kinds of geologic praxis can take and make place differently? How might geoethics negotiate and name sites of operation between the bios, between the geos and race? How might we build a counter-cartography and think about inhuman memory as a site of reparation within colonial histories, histories that refuse or remediate infrastructures of colonial renewal? So I'll leave it there with the question of inhuman reparations. Thank you.
Kathryn, thank you so much. That was so fascinating. I think you could sort of ask dozens of questions about every single one of those slides. And the points that you presented. I wanted to start by asking you about the genesis of your work. You have a forthcoming book, Geologic Life, which you showed us an image from there. And this body
It's
work,
here.
there you are. And it sort of started with this one, wonderfully entitled "A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None."
It got a bit fatter.
Yeah, this is a nice pocket-sized, but also very dense. I wondered if you could talk a bit about how these ideas have evolved, and also how you came within the institutions, within university institutions, to decide to take up this challenge to defy geology from within the institution, and what kind of practice you decided to forge for yourself. And perhaps you could talk about some of the people that you cite in your work, because it's very rich, particularly in sort of black radical feminist traditions. Perhaps you could talk to us about that.
Thank you. That's a big question. Well, I started writing Geologic Life over 10 years ago, and it was an attempt to kind of give an account of geologic subjectivity, to really try and understand how the Earth is implicated in subjectivity and how we understand subjectivity, but also how subjectivity is implicated in the Earth. So that was kind of pretty much where I started off, but I guess it went on a detour which had a very precise geography. Actually, I was in LA looking at oil and gas museums just after Michael Brown was shot, and then spent my sabbatical out on the streets, learning a lot from the activists and people there, and also the militarization of the police. And slowly, I think I began to understand the connections between oil and gas and what was happening in terms of anti-blackness and, and anti-brownness. And not just, I'd always, as someone in the environment and interested in kind of theories of the Earth, I'd always understood that in terms of extraction sites or theories of the Earth, but I never really kind of fully realized the connections at a much deeper structural level in terms of like just even the languages we use to describe the materiality of the world. And this frustration of being in geography, which is probably the most imperial of subjects, where there's a lot of amazing work going on in critical geography, but there's also this kind of incredible whiteness of the discipline, and these problematic histories that sediment through everything we do. So it was a way of trying to understand my own location and how I was located in a discipline that I often felt very at home in. But also this, very kind of this moment of realizing the extraordinary kind of depth of that violence, and the kind of structural depth of that violence across that. You couldn't speak about the Earth without first speaking about anti-blackness, and that had to come first. And that's what my kind of training in the environment taught me by default, in a sense, or maybe that's what I learned out on the street from these very fantastic, thoughtful activists.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about that. I'm really interested in how you work with language and the role of poetics in your work, and how it seems that that's, I don't know, the only possible way, but if you're writing, perhaps the only, in the academy, the only way to overcome the constraints of an entire discipline written in a language that's inherently imperial or colonial in logic. And I wonder whether you could talk about language, and also how you forged so many new, terms yourself, or had to. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Language, was kind of at the heart of it in terms of trying to think, what does a language need to look like that allows us to understand different sets of relationships. And as you say, I mean, geography is very much the a language of mastery, a language of kind of extraction. But I was also really kind of inspired by a lot of the writers who were writing during the sort of anti-colonial movements, like Edward Glissant, Amy Césaire, Emmanuel Cabral, and just the way in which they understood implicitly that they had to forge a new language, and that they had to forge a new language that had the earth as a kind of partner in that languaging. So Glissant and Césaire, for example, always, and Fanon, and, the wretched of the earth is not a kind of metaphoric, claim. It's very, it's that recognition that the earth needed to be kind of spoken, and that actually that speaking could create a new form of subjective understanding of who we are. And, especially after such degraded kind of forms of subjective life that had happened under colonialism and still happen. And a language for that horror, but also a language that allowed kind of, the possibilities of freedom and not living in the kind of containment of someone else's understanding of your subjectivity. And I think what was amazing about those writers is that they're often thought of as kind of political writers, but they were also like writing a completely new materiality into being, a kind of subjective materiality. So I kind of think about them as materialists as well.
It's made me think, of course, about Inhuman and Human, and the play that you make, throughout your work on that, where it's you're problematizing it, but you also see some kind of future potential in re-understanding those terms, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, rethinking the Inhuman, and I think this is kind of led by that anti-colonial work, is that it doesn't shy away from like actually reclaiming that kind of connection as something that may be a site of political work and freedom, and so in a sense I'm just kind of following after that. I mean, I think that all that work that was done, that we often kind of is not necessarily kind of in our classrooms, or I mean, I think there was an amazing understanding during that sort of anti-colonial movements that you actually had to rethink the world and the earth and your kind of place in it. And now the big picture is very much dominated by tech bros and kind of, it's like, so there's also a way in which there's a kind of understanding that we have to understand, we have to have a philosophy of the earth, or a way of thinking the earth now, that is kind of, has the specificity, but also the enormity of, of generosity to think in a kind of planetary terms.
I wonder whether we could open up for some questions from the audience. I'm sure there are questions. We have a microphone. If you raise your hands in.
Obrigada. Na verdade é uma pergunta do streaming. Não podes traduzir para a Kathryn? São duas perguntas, mas são relativamente simples e eu acho que podemos colocá-las à Kathryn, mas vê. A primeira é como é que a Kathryn localiza a contribuição dos povos originários, africanos e latino-americanos neste debate, se serão ouvidos. Penso que isto tem mais que ver com a geoética. E a segunda pergunta é se a Kathryn identifica autores ou autoras africanas e latino-americanas que já estão a apresentar outro tipo de experiências, além dos que foram mencionados, como Fanon e outras pessoas.
Desculpa, eu vou...
Queres que repita?
Sim.
Ok. Então, a primeira pergunta é se a Kathryn identifica a contribuição dos povos originários.
Do you identify the work of the post... Somebody help me, Margarida. Post-originary?
Povos originários.
Sorry. Of original First Nations, thank you, people. Do you identify any...
Povos originários, africanos e latino-americanos neste debate, se serão ouvidos?
Latin American
and African people in this debate?
In this debate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think maybe the thing to just, which is a preface to all of what I've said, is that, you know, Indigenous people don't, you know, they already have a language. Our Indigenous colleagues already know, like, how to, you know, that division is between the bios and the geos is not a, you know, if you're Aboriginal kind of community, you can have a rock in the family. You know, this is a very particular Western construct of, but I think, so yes, absolutely. I think why I concentrate on anti-Blackness as the kind of the hinge in this kind of system of thought is because that is, you know, in colonial thought, that is the hinge on in which this division between bios and geos pivots. Indigeneity is mapped in between that. Indigeneity is mapped sort of as subterranean, as a kind of space of evacuation for new settler stories of belonging. But I think, you know, Indigenous authors have written, you know, extensively and importantly about those relations to land. They're not my, they're not my stories to tell in a sense. I think the complicated process of learning, particularly in the Caribbean, how to make a land, how to be replanted in a land that is not yours and that is kind of, you know, has an Indigenous population and where you're there under duress, I think is a different problematic and a different kind of set of challenges to how you kind of begin to think about your subjectivity. So sorry, that was a long, I hope that sort of, but yes is the very quick answer to that.
I think there's another question.
And the second question was if Kathryn knows about any authors, African, Latin American, Indigenous, that are also sharing their experiences and knowledge about this question. If she wants to mention some, she mentioned a lot of them throughout the conference, but perhaps any other suggestions? And that's it.
Did you
okay, yeah. Well, I mean, I've been reading, you know, just off the top of my head, there's a new translation, one of my colleagues translated Beatrice Nemesito's work, The Dialectic in the Sea, who's a Brazilian author who writes about the Quilombo. And, you know, that's an extraordinary kind of set of writings and work. And I actually recently came back from South Africa, and we're running a reading group of African writers with the University of Cape Town. And actually, I highly recommend, Hugo Canham's, I don't know whether you can, Hugo Canham's book, Riotous Deathscapes, which is all about sort of this kind of, it's a rural account of kind of the effects of those kind of extraction histories in South Africa. But it's an extraordinarily beautiful kind of queer and he brings both indigeneity and blackness together as, you know, as a kind of South African history. But it's a very beautiful text, and I highly recommend it to anybody that is looking for something to read.
And here in the room, I'm sure we also have some questions.
Yeah. But I also, just to say, I'm very happy, I'm always happy if people send me things that I should be reading. So please feel free to add to the bibliography.
Maybe not a question, but just a trigger so we can have further conversations, because we've been talking so much about the past and present, and I like to think interscalarly towards the future, and some activism I do is on deep sea mining. And curiously enough, one of the places that will not be mined by agreement of the International Seabed Authority is the Mid-Atlantic Passage. So there's something on the complexity of these interscalar kind of stratifications of power that are being somehow acknowledged and unacknowledged. But there's also a debate very big in terms of international projects of governance towards these distinctions of the bios and the geos in terms of extraction in the seabed. So I wonder, in this moment of blue economy where we're projecting further, you know, even the stakeholders, we want to have the new environmental subjects, how these kind of debates in terms of kind of racialized stratigraphies of the ocean or of the coastal communities have come into terms also in your work, and how you're thinking about different kind of, the blue debate there, because I think there's different new imperialist movements being done. Yeah. Sorry, this was a long riff, but I was just curious to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you probably know more about it than I do. But I think that, these questions about mining and whether you're mining sort of deep sea or sort of on territory, they're the same questions in a sense, but it's perhaps even more difficult to generate a sort of understanding of a kind of a subjective geology, geologic subjects within the ocean bed. I think the way in which I guess it gets articulated is often through the impact on the connection between sort of fisheries and local communities. I guess, to introduce another sort of mid-Atlantic, while there isn't going to be deep sea mining, which I think, in some ways is a taciturn recognition of the Middle Passage as a kind of a memorial, in a way that, there's not really been any official kind of acknowledgement of the kind of those histories in that space. So, in one sense, this is a kind of a recognition of a kind of spatial reparation for kind of, what is essentially a gravesite. But in another way, at the same time, there's not going to be deep sea mining. The Google cable that goes from Lisbon to Africa that it's named after Equino, the former enslaved person, is running along that route. And that has a very direct sort of, you know, we can think about the sort of new colonial geographies of data mining that has a very particular sort of new life that is kind of not unconnected to its old life. So I think that, I mean, mining in the seabed is a really, you know, I mean, it's a really important topic to be mobilized, right, in kind of new imaginations of those kind of subterranean spaces, and, you know, and to kind of connect with a kind of geologic, you know, seabed, as, you know, as kind of part of kind of both the history and you know, forms of life. So I don't have any kind of straightforward answer to that. Only to, you know, I mean, I think it is a sort of default recognition of the Middle Passage as a site of kind of inhuman memory, and I think that's something that maybe, you know, artists may and others may take up in as kind of as a site to think with. I think there's an importance in destabilizing the kind of territory and territory as land, and thinking with the seas, the oceans, the mangroves, the kind of all the blue spaces as integral to a kind of geoethics. I'd really like to hear what you have to say. If you want to tell us more about how we should be thinking about these spaces.
I don't know if I know enough as well, because I'm just learning as I go, but I started doing some activism here in the Azores Islands and been in touch over 7 years with activists in the Pacific around Fiji and Tonga. And we just had a very beautiful session on Pacific resistance, which was actually widening our views of, you know, the water column and the seabed. And this amazing policymaker from Fiji, she was just expanding our relation to the geos of the seabed, saying that, you know, it's always difficult to bring it into conversation in spaces of law or of reason or of certain kinds of supremacism of language. And she just shared this beautiful story that in her own home, the seabed was the place for shape-shifting, the place of ancestrality of past and future. It's also where the genome of life is coming to be. So I find it a very productive space to think with, and I've been trying to get my way around it and write around it. But it's good to do it collectively, so we have different understandings of how the bios and geos come into our lives, I think. We can have a kind of collective geo-poetics. Yeah.
Thank you.
Question?
Hi, hello.
Hello.
So I don't know if it's a good question, but I was thinking, especially because I work a lot with the young generation. Do you know any program, or do you work also with schools so you can show this new way, not new way of course, but this new thinking about, because at school we never learn all of this and it's a different point of learning and knowing. So if you know any programs or people, or if you're doing that work at schools, because I think it's important also when we talk about that something is wrong and that we need to change, it's important also to give like the good answers. I don't know if they are good, but something needs to be different. So do you have any of this going on somewhere?
I mean, I think there's kind of amazing environment programs, and then there's also amazing work around kind of decolonizing the archive. Often it seems like, I guess, what I've been really keen to think about is how we join these up. So, you know, how we join up, you know, for example, questions of reparations with the kind of loss and damage fund in climate change, for example, and actually see these as the same question and not divided questions. I mean, but in some ways, the first thing we also have to do is just kind of teach these histories, and you know that's what becomes quite difficult in our respective governments to often even just teach kind of histories. So, I mean, in our geography department, I teach a course on colonial afterlives because we all have one, and you know that's a good way into a lot of these questions. And I'm just starting a new module on race and the environment. But I think a lot of the ways in which things get separated also kind of reinforces a certain kind of politics. So I guess my kind of interdisciplinary practice has always been concerned with like trying to join things up so that we do get the whole picture. I think disciplines are a way of containing and sort of you know, displacing often the kind of the politics of what's at stake. And so the more we can, in our schools and in the places that we're in doing work, join up these questions, I think the better. So I think there's also kind of, yeah, I mean, there's a deep pedagogical, you know, question there. I mean, one of the ways, like, been involved in this project about writing climate with Indigenous authors in Australia, for example. And that's been really insightful in terms of just like what it means to take sort of text and think about kind of geoethics within a classroom, and, you know, and also the huge resistance to that. So,
Thank you.
We're in difficult times, so but I also just started teaching Fanon to my students, reading Fanon and Glisson and you know, Walter Rodney and so on, and that's been amazing. Actually, that's been really, really incredible.
We have time for one more question from the audience, if there is one, or online.
We have one question. It's from the same person that did the questions before. It's Resinia Garcia from Brazil. And I'll try to translate it to English, but I might need some help. Okay. So she says, there's a difference between decolonial and counter-colonial thought. Without having those peoples talking by themselves, they are always still being read by others, by our gaze. And about ways of listening to these people without filters. How can we do this? My translation might not be so good. Should I read it in Portuguese for you to translate it, Naomi? Okay, so in Portuguese is: há diferença entre pensamento decolonial e contracolonial. Sem que essas pessoas falem por si mesmas, estarão sempre sendo lidas pelo nosso olhar. E sobre formas de ouvi-las, sem filtros, como?
Pode só repetir a primeira linha, desculpa.
Há diferença entre pensamento decolonial e contracolonial.
Oh, the difference between decolonial and there's a difference between.
There's a difference between,
countercolonial.
It's an affirmation, not a question.
Yeah, absolutely. or anti-colonial.
And that being taught about that always be within our gaze.
Without having these people talking for themselves, they are always being read by our own gaze. And about ways of listening to them with no filters. How can we do this?
Well, I think, I mean, the most important thing I think is to have, you know, a kind of diverse set of people in the room. And that's, you know, so 1 billion Black Anthropocenes came out of the frustration of always being in kind of spaces of the Anthropocene with kind of just a lot of white men, and, you know, this idea that you could organize a future around that particular constituency is deeply problematic. But I think kind of, you know, I mean, I think that there's so much fantastic writing, artwork, poetry by Indigenous, you know, anti-colonial. I think there's just kind of, in some ways, bringing that into a sort of discussion with the, you know, the texts that structure our kind of academic and otherwise lives, whether sort of directly or indirectly. So, you know, I think people bring their own voice into the room. It's whether, I think often the gatekeeping around that is the problem in a sense. So, you know, as, you know, whatever field we work in, you know, we have power. We have power over what we think with, what we teach, what we reproduce. So, but yes, decolonial and anti-colonial can often be very different things. Anti-colonial can often involve a gun. Decolonial can often be very gestural. But I think, you know, I think we need decoloniality to mean something. And what that means is going to be different in different institutions.
There's no more response.
Yeah. But I think just teaching those histories is really important, to know those histories. And I don't think we do. I didn't grow up learning those histories, and I don't think, you know, they're still very much repressed within the UK as a, you know, everybody else knows more about British colonialism than most British people, I would say. I don't know whether it's the same in Portugal.
Yeah, I think you would say the same in Portugal. There's this sort of ongoing struggle for, you know, even the sort of most basic facts of the history of enslavement and colonialism to be recognised and to be incorporated in the curriculum. For example, there's, you know, ongoing struggle for school textbooks to reflect just a non-colonial worldview from the whole way that history is told here and monumentalized, and how that plays out in other structures of society. So I think it's really interesting to hear how you've tried to counter the institutions of geology from within the academy. And just maybe I'll end on that note by saying thank you for sharing your work, and thank you for everyone who's here and participated here and online. So thank you.
It's been a pleasure. So thank you so much.